Okay, so today we're going to kind of turn a corner here. This is really getting, at this point in time in Paul's life, we're getting into the primary portion of his missionary ministry. Today we're going to go to the city of Corinth. Of course, over the last few weeks, we saw Paul come into Macedonia, and he's been to Berea and Thessalonica and Philippi, and went to Athens and preached at Mars Hill, and he was alone in Athens. And while he did have some very limited success, it wasn't much. And because he was alone and wasn't having much success, I think a lot of the conversation there, these educational elites, they just ask questions, and more, questions lead to more questions, lead to more questions, and I don't think he was really getting anywhere with them. And so uh, he finally decided to leave and come to Corinth. And we're going to spend 2 weeks here, this week and next week in the city of Corinth. He does visit Corinth again on his next missionary journey, his third one. And so we'll have some more information there, as well as we have another trip. But there's so much about this city. This city was a fascinating city, really. Uh, it was kind of a epicenter for um, pagan mythological beliefs, different gods and goddesses. It was also a cultural center for trade because of its location. It was the site of the Isthmian Games. And so there's just so much going on in the city of Corinth. And I have a separate Bible study, and I might do that next year. Uh, go ahead and go through that Bible study. It'd be a 10 to 15 week Bible study to go through that, but you really get to know the city very well in that Bible study. And I think it's a good one. So I might do that. I also have in the description box below, I've got a link to a video here about Corinth. And while he's in Corinth on this first missionary journey, he writes letters to the Thessalonians, who he had just left there. And so we'll take a look at those. We'll look at First Thessalonians this week, and then the second letter next week. We'll just kind of break that up into both sides. But so what he arrives in Corinth alone, okay, and then he meets Aquila and Priscilla, and they are both tent makers, just like he is, and so they invite him to stay with them, and he stays for a year and a half, and starts this church. And this church, the people that they're bringing, that are accepting God and becoming Christians and coming into the church from this community, are coming out of a very vulgar, uh, just a disgusting community. And they really struggle. I mean, the young church has a lot of struggles, and we'll see that on his third missionary journey when he's in Ephesus, and people from Corinth visit him. And so he writes a couple letters to them from that point. So we'll cover those letters too. So you're going to get a lot of Corinth in this whole Bible study. The couple visits that he has, we'll look at different things, and that he writes, we'll look at those things. But this this first time that we're going through this, I'm going to kind of stick to my process, go over the page of information that I've created for each of these locations, and just kind of look at his initial visit as it's described in the Bible, and kind of go over that. But so let's look at the timeline here first. And this is the timeline we've been looking at. And you're going to see in here, one of the things that they have confirmed is that he was in Corinth in 51 AD. And I got him coming about 50 AD. He spent a year and a half there, so that would add up. Now, all of these dates up until about the time that Barnabas goes to get him from Tarsus, these dates are not confirmed. I mean, I don't know exactly what year he was born, and so it's hard to put a date and time on all of this, the early stuff. But by the time he's brought back, we know from here on out how everything played out, what times he was in what places. And so we have a confirmation that he was in Corinth in 51 AD, as we'll look at today. And if you look on here, he comes from Athens. Before that, he was in Berea, and before that in Thessalonica. And basically, when he entered into Macedonia, he came to Philippi and was driven out, went to Thessalonica, and he was pretty well received at Thessalonica, but people from Philippi came and drove him out to Berea. And then these people just kept following him and driving him out. And so he really had a good feeling about this church in Thessalonica, and so he wanted to write to them. And so we'll look at this. This is my timeline of chronological order of the New Testament canon. And so we looked at when James wrote his book after Herod killed John's brother James. And then we looked at Paul wrote Galatians after the Council of Jerusalem. And then Matthew, around this same time, wrote to the Hellenistic Jews to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. And as you remember, Matthew was a tax collector, so basically like an accountant, and he really was trying to reconcile, the prophecies of the Old Testament with the life of Jesus. And so uh, we have that. And so the next books that are going to be written are going to be the letters to the Thessalonians. And so we'll look at those two letters. Uh, Another thing I wanted to look at is this map. Let's look at this map first because this is the initial one that we've been using. Of course, he left Troas and came over to Macedonia and was in Philippi, and then went to Thessalonica and then Berea, and then was sent down to Athens, and now he's in Corinth right here at this little isthmus area. I guess I can't do that and keep my markings, but he's right here. And I want to show you this because this gives you a good picture of all the pagan stuff that they're dealing with. And if you can look just right in the center of the screen, this is Corinth here. And this over here gives you an idea of all the pagan sanctuaries, oracles, the Pan-Hellenic, which are kind of the Greek mythological uh, cults. You have mystery cults here, and so there's a lot of stuff. I mean, they're worshiping Aphrodite, Apollo, Artemis, Asclepius, and this is a god of healing, which had a place here in Corinth. And one of the things they did there was basically whatever part of their body hurt, like if their arm hurt, they would go and have a mold, kind of a mold of an arm made up and take it into the temple and leave it as a sacrifice to this God, hoping that they would heal his arm. And so, Paul talked a lot in the letter to the Corinthians about us being members of one body, of the body of Christ. And I think that's one of the reasons he referenced that. But we're also going to see a reference to the Bema seat while he is here in Corinth, and he spoke about the Bema seat of Christ coming for the judgment seat of Christ. And so we'll see how that worked out. But over here on the right side is Ephesus, if you can see that. And so, I mean, you can just see all of this. I mean, this whole region is just inundated with mythological gods and goddesses. And of course, Poseidon down here was the god of the sea. And so they're surrounded by water. And so he was everywhere. Apollo is one we'll talk about today. Apollo had a big temple here in Delphi, which was up in the mountains. And when they had their worship ceremonies, I mean, they would bang this gong all night long. And I think the sound just kind of rolled across the water right into Corinth. But Corinth had its own problems. They had several gods and goddesses that were being worshipped right there in town. And so you have all of that going on, plus the Isthmian games, which I expect probably were played during this time. It would have been a good time for them to make some money. But let's look first at the sheet that I've got on Corinth. The history: during the rise of Athens, Corinth fell into ruins. It aligned with Sparta during the Peloponnesian Wars and with Athens during the Corinthian Wars. As a member of the Achaean League, it came into conflict with Rome and was captured, burned, and sacked by the Roman consul Minius. The men and women and children were sold into slavery, and for a century it laid idle until the slaves were freed, and it quickly became a commercial center of the region. And if you just look at where it's placed, I mean, it almost has to be. In fact, let me erase all of this if I can. Right there. That's not what I want to do. But I mean, just see where it's at here. I mean, the waterways here were major traffic routes, and so I mean, it was just a good place for commercial industry, and so it quickly became that the commercial center of the region. Paul had limited success in Athens. He did have some success, but like I said, it was just a questions game. And so he set out to Corinth, hoping for a better response to his message. It was the first of 3 visits to Corinth. It was in Corinth that he met Aquila and Priscilla and remained there for 18 months, working as a tent maker, taking the message first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. Corinth had a reputation as a corrupt and wicked city, and Paul's letter to the Corinthians addressed several questions regarding sexual immorality and idol worship. And so, what we're going to do this week, I'm going to go through this primary part. Next week, we're going to look some at the mystery religions and things that were going on there in Corinth that affected his ministry, and maybe even look a little bit at the games that took place, probably why he was there. And then, of course, he wrote his letters to the Corinthians on the third missionary journey when he was in Ephesus. So we'll take that back up later on. But that's what all's to come here. And in Corinth, he wrote 2 letters to the Thessalonians. It was also in Corinth that Timothy and Silas rejoined him. And so that's where we're at. So I want to read the biblical account here real quick. As we see, it says this is Acts chapter 18, and I'm going to put First Thessalonians and Acts chapter 18 both as reading for this week, and then I have a video of Corinth that I'll put in the description below. So he departed from Athens, came to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, who was born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, and his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And so basically Nero had died, and Claudius had come to a power just briefly, but he chased the Jews out as much as he could. The Christians really stayed, most of them, but you see a lot of persecution come after Claudius's reign. It was because the same craft he abode with them and wrought, and for this occupation they were tent makers, and so he stayed with them because they could do the same work. And the Isthmian Games, it was a time when people would converge on a city. I mean, they didn't have hotels like they had today, so tent cities will pop up all around whatever the activity was going on. And so, I mean, there were a lot of tents set up if the games were in town. And so it would have been a good time, not only to work and make money, but also to spread the gospel. So that's why I think he probably stayed a year and a half so that he could be there for the games. But the Bible doesn't say that, and I can't really confirm that 100%. As he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded Jews and Greeks, when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. When they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go to the Gentiles. It's the same consistent theme we've seen throughout his whole ministry. He goes to the Jews until they reject him, and then he goes to the Gentiles. And so he departed thence and entered a certain man's house named Justus, one of that worship God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. And this was a synagogue, some sort of leader in the synagogue. And he actually left the synagogue and came out and became a believer. And Crispus too was the chief ruler of the synagogue. So basically you had the hierarchy of the synagogue left the synagogue to follow Paul's teachings of Christianity and the synagogue. So they were very angry at what was going on. But he was a chief ruler of the synagogue, and he believed in the Lord and all his house, and many Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. And then spake the Lord to Paul by a night vision and said, be not afraid to speak and hold not thy peace, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in the city. And so Paul was given a promise to God to stay and continue his work. So he continued there for a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among all them. And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. And this is the Bema seat. And next week I'll talk about that. I've got some pictures of it to show you. Saying that this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And basically, this was Romans saying that the only God really was the Roman emperor. And so, I mean, they were supposed to worship him and all Roman gods and nobody else. And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it's a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will not be a judge of such matters. And so he basically said, "You don't bring your problems to me to judge. You deal with them." So he drove them from the judgment seat, and then all the Greeks took uh, Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. Gallio cared for none of those things. And so all this was going on. Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, sailed into Syria, and took with him Aquila and Priscilla. And this is where he headed back over to Ephesus. So that's kind of the story of his time there, just a brief and part of it. And so um, I'm going to look too at this writing of Thessalonians. And so, because he did write two letters to Thessalonians, like I say, we'll just do this first one. So, First Thessalonians was the first correspondence of Paul to the church in the city of Thessalonica. And I mean, that they were just wonderful people. And I think Paul just had something in his heart for them and just really wanted to get to know them better, really. The Apostle Paul wrote in 51 AD. This date is archaeologically verified. As I said, there's an inscription in the temple of Apollos at Delphi near Corinth, and so that's this temple up in the mountains right here that he oh, sure what I'm doing here. Anyway, I got out of sorts, so I'm gonna move on. But it was that temple. There's an inscription there talking about Paul being there. So Thessalonica became the capital of Macedonia in 168 BC and was ruled by its own citizens, yet part of the Roman Empire. So they were kind of an independent place. Paul, Timothy, and Silas visited Thessalonica on the second missionary journey, only to be evicted from the city by non-believing Jews and the people that came from Philippi. And he wrote to them primarily to follow up after his separation from the church. There are five themes evident in First Thessalonians. So first, you have the apologetic theme, which is with historical correlation between Acts and First Thessalonians. And so, if you want to get First Thessalonians and see the correlation with Acts, and then you have the ecclesiastical theme, which portrays a healthy, growing church, which it was healthy and growing. It has a pastoral theme with examples of shepherding activities and attitudes. I'll tell you what, First Thessalonians is a wonderful book to read. It has an eschatological theme, focusing on future events as the church's hope. They talk about the rapture and our time we'll spend with the Lord in the future. And then it has a missionary theme with emphasis on the gospel proclamation and church planning. And so here's a outline. And again, this taken from MacArthur Study Bible. And as I've said in other videos, I'm not real fond of MacArthur, but Study Bible historically it has good notes. Doctrinally, it's questionable, but so here's the outline that it gives. Paul's greeting, his personal thoughts. He has thanksgiving for the church, reminders for the church, concerns for the church. He talks about moral purity, disciplined living, death and the rapture, on holy living in the day of the Lord, on church relationships, the basics of Christian living. So then a benediction and final remarks. So, I mean, if you just want to be blessed, it's only 5 chapters. I mean, you can probably read it in half an hour. I mean, it doesn't take long at all. But so I hope you'll go read that, and we'll go ahead and stop there and pick up Corinth next week and talk more about the Isthmian Games and about some of the religions and cults and stuff that was going on there. And I think once you understand some of the pagan rituals that were going on there, you understand some of the things that were in the church and why they affected some of his teachings. And I think a lot of the teachings in modern day churches are taken out of context because Paul was addressing a very particular situations there in Corinth. And modern day churches, I think, they don't know how to rightly divide the word of truth, and so they just take everything to mean what they said and want to do. But we'll leave it there, and we'll revisit again next week. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time. God bless you.